Egypt, a land of hidden treasures, buried secrets, and spectacular new finds. These ancient rock carvings may be the key to understanding how this nation was born. They bring to life a long-forgotten king called Scorpion. The evidence suggests his reign laid the groundwork for history's most enduring civilization. Can today's archaeologists piece together the world of the Scorpion King? The glories of ancient Egypt, from its magnificent temples to its breathtaking burial chambers. Archaeologists have struggled to explain how this extraordinary society suddenly came into being 5,000 years ago. But now the latest in a series of discoveries is changing the way they think about the dawn of civilization itself. Jebel Chauti in southern Egypt, 10 miles to the west of the River Nile. Archaeologist John Darnell has been exploring this region for years. While tracing an early trade route through the arid landscape, he made a discovery that's shedding new light on one of Egypt's most intriguing rulers.
At this site is this natural rock shelf with some very nicely faceted bits of limestone that invite carving. The ancient Egyptians couldn't resist, and they very seldom did, fortunately, and this site is covered with inscriptions. We actually discovered the site very late in the day, so the light was beginning to fade.
In the confusion of ancient graffiti, one section leapt out at Darnell and his team.
On this very nice, high piece of rock were some very odd images that were clearly something very interesting, but we had no idea at the time what it would actually turn out to be.
Darnell began to unravel the tangle of scratched lines. He saw a procession of figures, humans and animals. The drawing was old, even by Egyptian standards. Its style dated it to 200 years before the pharaohs. Yet it also bore a symbol with which the pharaohs were linked: the image of the falcon god, Horus. This was the emblem of a king.
The falcon comes to be the earliest designation of Egyptian kingship. There are a number of rulers who are known from a label of a falcon with some other symbol.
So Darnell was now looking for that second symbol to give him the name of a king. He found it directly below the falcon. It was one of the most distinctive creatures of the desert, the scorpion.
If this is indeed a tableau of a ruler who went by the specific royal designation of Horus Scorpion, then this is a monument of a king scorpion. And an actual attempt at a historical treatise of some event during the reign of King Scorpion.
Darnell still had to decode the scene's exact meaning. But the name itself caused great excitement. Historians had been hunting King Scorpion for nearly 100 years.
The Scorpion King actually is like a mysterious king. His name is very interesting to everyone.
The first sign he even existed was found 60 miles away from Jebel Chauti, at the ancient city of Hierakonpolis. In 1898, British archaeologist James Quibell unearthed a number of stone fragments covered in carvings. When he pieced them together, they formed a mace head. The mace, a stone mounted on a wooden shaft, was an early weapon of war. This outsized version was clearly meant for ceremonial use. Among the decorations on its surface, Quibell found the unmistakable image of a scorpion. As he studied the scene in more detail, he realized the central figure looked like a pharaoh. His headdress was a crown of the type worn by kings throughout Egypt's history. Other pieces of royal regalia are plain to see.
He's wearing the royal kilt. He's also got a bull's tail that hangs down beside. These things are only worn by kings.
So, who is he? Quibel turned to two symbols next to his head, the scorpion and a rosette. Together, they gave him a name.
We have other objects that have this little rosette followed by what is clearly a name, so we're reasonably sure that this mace head does in fact show us a king named Scorpion.
From the style of the carving, Quibel realized the mace head must date to early on in Egyptian history. The name alone seems to link him to the first pharaohs.
If you look at the kings of the first dynasty, you have King Fighter, King Fortress, King Cobra, King Slayer of Hearts. And so there's a kind of military or aggressive theme in these names. And I think that's because these kings were first and foremost defenders of their countries and also war leaders. And so King Scorpion with the deadly sting is a perfectly sensible name in that kind of atmosphere.
But Quibel and his colleagues were baffled. The Egyptians left detailed lists of successive dynasties of pharaohs. They were literally set in stone. None bore the name of Scorpion. But then, just yards from where he'd found the mace head, Quibel made a second discovery. It helped locate King Scorpion's place in history.
This is the amazing object we call the Narmer palette, which has been called the first historical document in the world.
The palette is a ceremonial version of a flat stone used to mix pigments and cosmetics. Decorated on both sides, the intricate carving again reveals the image of a king. Two hieroglyphs feature on both sides, a catfish and a chisel. They spell out a name, Narmer. The style of the carving is similar to the mace head depicting the Scorpion King. The figures even wear the same royal headdress. But there is a key difference. There's a second crown worn only by Narmer. It reveals he ruled a far greater territory. Scholars of Quibel's time knew that ancient Egyptians saw their land as having two distinct halves.
There was Upper Egypt, which was the narrow Nile Valley in the south of the country, and Lower Egypt, which was the broad expanse of the delta in the north. And so when a single ruler came to dominate the entire country, the symbolism of his rule echoed those two halves of the country.
Typical portrayals of a pharaoh show him wearing both the tall crown of Upper Egypt and the very different crown of Lower Egypt. Scorpion seems to reign over the south, but Narmer rules north and south. This is the earliest image ever found showing a king ruling over both halves of Egypt. Experts concluded that the scenes record the moment Egypt was unified and Narmer, in victory, became its first pharaoh. The parallels with the mace head suggested the Scorpion King came from the same era.
Because the way that Narmer is depicted on that palette is so similar to the way that the Scorpion King is shown on the mace head, we can deduce that the Scorpion King must have been a contemporary or even earlier than Narmer, and so a king before the first dynasty.
Scorpion displayed many characteristics of a full pharaoh, but he came from an earlier age. Archaeologists had just opened a door on a whole new chapter of Egyptian history. At the time, it was widely assumed that Egyptian civilization sprang up suddenly in around 3000 BC with the arrival of the first pharaohs.
Many people had thought it had to be an invasion of a superior race. The exquisite beauty of the things that the Egyptian civilization created. At the turn of the century, people didn't want to believe this was coming out of Africa. They wanted to root it in Mesopotamia or even in Europe. In some ways, it was quite racist.
Few Egyptologists questioned the accepted idea that the pharaohs were foreign invaders bringing rapid progress to a backward country. But with Quibel's discovery of a king who predated the pharaohs, cracks began to appear in this theory. The history books were about to be rewritten.
The discovery that there were kings even before Narmer, even before the first dynasty, has forced Egyptologists to invent a new term, Dynasty Zero, which really comprises all the rulers from different parts of the country who reigned before the first dynasty.
James Quibel and his colleagues had revealed both a previously unknown era and the existence of a man whose name has intrigued experts ever since. Now, a century later, archaeologists are piecing together the life and remarkable achievements of the Scorpion King. Darnell is convinced these strange figures record a key event in Scorpion's life.
Going from right to left, then following the scorpion, is a standard, a divine standard, apparently an animal on a vertical pole, which is followed by a man in a long cloak holding a staff, possibly a priestly figure. This is the depiction of a prisoner. His arms are tied in a hideously contorted fashion behind his back. His hair is billowing out behind him rather wildly, and he's tied to this rope held apparently in the hands of this large male figure brandishing a mace in the hand.
Darnell believes this is King Scorpion himself. His pose alone bears a striking resemblance to an image carved time and again by successive Egyptian pharaohs. Towering over an enemy prisoner, mace raised, they prepare to deliver a final blow. The scene was often just symbolic, but could also mark a military victory. Darnell believes his tableau celebrates a genuine battle. He sees further evidence in the pairing of a stork and a serpent at its center.
It's been suggested that the stork and serpent symbolizes essentially order over chaos. That would mean in this tableau that the author is trying to tell us that this depiction of King Scorpion and his prisoner means victory.
So who has the Scorpion King defeated and taken prisoner? One clue may lie in the location of the rock itself. It's on a road leading away from the ancient city of Nakada. Before the pharaohs unified Egypt, Nakada was a rival power base to Hierakonpolis and Abydos, the other great cities of southern Egypt.
We can visualize those three kingdoms beginning to compete for ultimate authority over the whole of Upper Egypt as we move through the pre-dynastic period.
On the carved mace head, King Scorpion wears the tall crown of Upper Egypt, suggesting that it was he who won this power struggle. Darnell believes the rock carving may record a decisive battle along the way.
As Scorpion and his prisoner are facing towards the ascent of the road behind, it looks as though he's leading his prisoner from the region of Nakada back along this road, probably towards Abydos.
If so, this is a milestone in the history of Egypt. By overcoming Nakada, the Scorpion King would have united all of Upper Egypt, the south, under his rule. This in turn paved the way for his successor, Narmer, to extend his power to the north and unite the whole of Egypt under its first pharaoh.
I believe the Scorpion tableau commemorates the event that was probably the final military action leading to the unification of Upper Egypt and the establishment of Dynasty Zero.
Darnell has dated the rock carving to around 200 years earlier than the mace head. He believes this is a sign of just how important a figure King Scorpion was to Egypt's early rulers.
I believe that the scorpion mace head may very well have been carved under Narmer in honor of the person Narmer may have believed to be the unifier of Upper Egypt, his spiritual and political predecessor.
It may be that Narmer's final domination of Egypt would never have happened without Scorpion's triumph in the south. On the mace head, this is shown as a crushing victory. Above the Scorpion King, the series of poles topped with standards are thought to represent different regions. The symbolism is brutal. From each standard, a lapwing bird hangs by its neck, signifying the subjugation of each region's people to their new scorpion master. It's perhaps a glimpse into the harsh world he inhabited.
To rise to the top in that kind of world, kings such as the Scorpion King must have been not only very strong leaders with great military skill, but also very charismatic leaders with the ability to garner support and to motivate people to follow them in their quest for glory.
Darnell believes his find has revealed Scorpion as a great warrior king, the man who first brought the territory of southern Egypt under the control of one ruler. But archaeologists have also discovered new evidence for the achievements of his reign. They found it in his tomb. The ancient city of Abydos lies just to the west of the Nile. This is where Darnell believes King Scorpion took his bound prisoner. It is also the burial place of Egypt's earliest pharaohs. Egyptians believed Osiris, the god of the dead, was buried here. That the site is littered with fragments of pottery is testament to this belief.
For centuries, pilgrims came here to worship Osiris, and they left their offering, pottery mainly. One may roughly estimate there are about fragments of 10 million pots here, but it's hard to count them.
Günther Dreyer was excavating the tombs of early pharaohs when he realized he'd come upon something much older and even more spectacular.
We revealed the first brick walls and couldn't believe it. There was one big chamber, and another chamber, and another chamber, and another chamber.
Now hidden once more beneath the sands to protect the mud brick structures, the tomb is composed of 12 chambers measuring over 800 square feet. Carbon dating revealed it had been built some 200 years before the first pharaohs.
We were so surprised because we didn't expect a tomb of that size for that period. So all this changed our idea of the early development of Egypt completely.
It was christened Tomb UJ.
That's Tomb UJ as we excavated it. This large chamber is the burial chamber to the west. There is some discoloration on the floor indicating the position of a large wooden shrine.
Whoever had been buried here was rich and powerful. Grave robbers had stripped out any precious objects, but numerous jars remained that had once contained supplies of oil and beer. There were 700 wine jars, enough to provide nearly 1,200 gallons. Then Dreyer had a breakthrough moment, proof that this was the tomb not of some wealthy merchant, but of a king.
In the corner here we found this crooked scepter in ivory, as a leftover of the equipment of the king, certainly indicating that that was the tomb of a ruler.
The ivory scepter was a precursor of the crook buried in Tutankhamun's tomb over 18 centuries later, one of the key symbols of a pharaoh's power. But which ruler did the scepter belong to? As Dreyer pieced together the pottery fragments, he discovered more clues, symbols of plants and animals. The jars originally contained oil or fat. Dreyer believes the markings show the estate that they came from and that each animal is the name of the estate's owner. Among the motifs is a scorpion.
This scorpion with his claws and the poisonous tail here. And a little plant below.
And it wasn't just one jar.
By far most frequent are the scorpions with the plant. We have about 70 scorpions, but only 6 fish, 5 snails, and so on. All these jars probably came from an estate founded by a ruler scorpion. And that's why we think that this is the tomb of that very scorpion.
Dreyer is convinced he has found the burial place of a king called Scorpion. And its date is a close match for the rock carving tableau discovered some 40 miles away by John Darnell.
What's very interesting about this tableau is that some of the closest parallels for various elements come from Tomb UJ at Abydos. In fact, based on style, on the iconography, this tableau could very well date to the lifetime of the man buried in Tomb UJ.
It seems that when the South was first unified, King Scorpion chose Abydos as the burial place for its rulers. The find was a major breakthrough in the search for this elusive figure. But as Dreyer analysed the tomb and its contents further, he found extraordinary new evidence that Scorpion may have played an even more vital role in the very birth of Egyptian civilization. Dreyer believes this was the origin of the palace-like tombs of the pharaohs. The exterior of Scorpion's tomb may also have contained the idea behind one of the pharaoh's most iconic inventions, the pyramid.
All these chambers had been roofed with wooden beams, a layer of matting on top, then some mud bricks, plaster, and most likely above there was this heap of sand and rubble forming an artificial mound.
Dreyer's excavations at Abydos have revealed that this mound developed over time into a stone superstructure known as a mastaba. This became the standard royal tomb until around 600 years after King Scorpion. Pharaoh Djoser was the first to stack smaller and smaller mastabas on top of each other. The result was the step pyramid and the massive structures we know today. Dr. Zahi Hawass, Egypt's chief archaeologist, has been studying the pyramids for years. With the discovery of King Scorpion's tomb, he now believes these iconic monuments owe a major debt to the ideas that first took shape in pre-dynastic Egypt.
Without this period, we'll not see the great monuments of pyramids and tombs in the Valley of the Kings. And this is why I really think that pre-dynastic period built Egypt.
And now there is growing evidence linking the Scorpion King to the birth of one of the hallmarks of civilization, writing. Scattered inside King Scorpion's tomb, Gunther Dreyer found about 180 small ivory tags. Each one was inscribed with mysterious images. Some obviously animals, others less clear. The implications are staggering.
When we found the first of these little tags in the sand filling of the chambers, we couldn't believe it. Because at the first glance, they resemble later hieroglyphs, but we knew writing only from a much later period, 200 years later. Could it be possible, was our question, that they knew writing already?
Hieroglyphs use both meaning and sound signs, which combine to form words. The pharaohs used hieroglyphs as the language of their kingdom for thousands of years. But no one had ever found any sign of hieroglyphs predating the pharaohs. It had always been thought that the idea of writing first arose not in North Africa, but in the Middle East, in ancient Mesopotamia. Here, by the time of the first pharaohs, a system of accounting, now called cuneiform, had already developed into writing. In Tomb Uj, which predates the pharaohs, each of the tags had a hole in it, suggesting it had once been attached either to the wooden boxes, whose remains were found nearby, or to other containers.
What could be the use of such labels? Just decoration? Not very likely. They had been fixed with these holes to something, and it was most likely that they transferred some information. So we started to understand them and to read them.
The breakthrough came when Dreyer found tags that made sense as hieroglyphs. One showed a stork and a seat.
What could be the meaning? Seated stork? Not very likely. But we know from later hieroglyphic writing, they represent phonetic values, phonetic sounds. The stork would be read ba. The seat, set. Together we could read Ba Set. And that in fact is the name of a city in the delta.
Ba Set was an ancient city over 300 miles to the north of Abydos. Dreyer now found other tags that could also be read as Egyptian place names.
The important thing is this is phonetic writing. Signs represent sounds of a language. And that's a major step in developing of writing. And these are the earliest examples of such phonetic writing, much earlier than what we know from Mesopotamia.
It means that the oldest piece of writing ever found is Egyptian. Dreyer's discovery is momentous.
And it shows the birth of civilization came with writing to Egypt long time before we thought. That was the beginning of writing.
Dreyer believes the tags were inscribed with the names of the cities and estates that sent their goods as taxes to the king. The decoding of these symbols has opened an incredible new window on the past.
We don't know about events or persons, rulers, without writing. And what we learn from Tomb Uj, the scorpion, King Scorpion's tomb, we regained 250 years of history of mankind.
The tags also reveal that the Scorpion King's influence reached far beyond his own territory in the south. As well as the hieroglyph for Ba Set, Dreyer found the name of a second city in the north, Buteau. Built on what was once the Mediterranean coast, recent excavations are confirming that this was a thriving trade hub with access to markets in the east. And it may have been vital to King Scorpion's interests. Many of the wine jars in his tomb came from outside Egypt, 500 miles from Abydos, in ancient Palestine.
No, he had trade relations to the Near East, to Palestine. And he must have been able to safeguard this trade route. So his influence must have been considerable.
So it seems the Scorpion King oversaw a critical period of Egyptian history. Not only was trade bringing north and south closer together, but the seeds were being sown for the glories that followed.
In Dynasty Zero, all the fundamental building blocks of ancient Egyptian civilization were first put in place. Notions of kingship, of authority, of control of the economy, of religion and art and architecture. It's in Dynasty Zero that these fundamentals are really put in place for the first time.
But now new evidence is suggesting that King Scorpion may have inherited a world far more sophisticated than was previously thought. Ancient Egypt. Traditionally, scholars thought this sophisticated society had arisen so suddenly, the pharaohs must have come from somewhere else.
Egyptologists looking at the great achievements of the pharaohs couldn't bring themselves to believe that Egyptian civilization had been created by North Africans, by the Egyptians themselves. They thought it must have been brought to Egypt from a more enlightened land as they saw it to the east, perhaps modern Mesopotamia.
Recent discoveries relating to the Scorpion King are showing just how wrong the early scholars were. A scene carved on a desert rock face suggests he played a key role in uniting the cities of Egypt 200 years before the first pharaoh. And the discovery of his tomb revealed evidence that some of the greatest achievements of Egyptian culture, the birth of writing and the invention of the pyramid, may have had their roots in his reign. The Scorpion King's existence was first discovered a century ago at the ancient city of Hierakonpolis in southern Egypt. Fresh excavations here are giving a remarkable new insight into his world. It appears to have been far more advanced than experts ever thought. The team of archaeologists is led by Dr. Renee Friedman. She's found proof that there was already a mighty city here centuries before the Scorpion King.
We know that it spread for at least 3 kilometers along the edge of what is now the low desert.
But Friedman has discovered an artifact that proves this god was being worshipped here hundreds of years before.
And this is the earliest datable statue of Horus, of a falcon, that we know of from pre-dynastic Egypt. It's really, really great to find one here.
Friedman has dated the falcon to 700 years before the first pharaohs. Her team have made other finds from the same period. They too are the earliest examples of their kind. One of the pharaoh's hallmarks was their centralized production of food and drink. Rations were then distributed to the people as pay or handouts. Evidence that this system was in place much earlier at Hierakonpolis has emerged with the discovery of an industrial-scale catering operation.
In the center would have been a large ceramic vat that would have stood about this tall, perhaps, and supporting it and suspending it up above the ground were these fire bars. And they have these fishtail ends, and they're arranged kind of on an angle, and then they would be cemented to the pot, so it stays absolutely still. And then fire is added around the sides. So what you're getting is a low, even heat.
7 more huge vats filled the gully. Walls of mud and pottery fragments enclosed the space, making sure the heat didn't escape. The final product was another surprise.
We get this residue, which is essentially burnt sugars. Imagine taking sugar and burning it to the bottom of your pot. That's what we're getting. But we've done the starch analysis on it, and we can see that the starches have been fermented. So we know for sure that what they're making here is beer.
Beer made from bread was a staple part of the Egyptian diet in the time of the pharaohs. And it's clear there was already a huge demand in ancient Hierakonpolis.
The brewery, with at least 8 vats, would have made over 1,000 gallons of beer every time it was in use. And it's estimated it could be brewing beer every 2 days. It's more than just what one family might need.
For Friedman, it's further proof that Egypt began much earlier than anyone had ever thought.
No one had expected this kind of advanced civilization at this period. And it continued to be a real question, both in our minds and other people's. Well, who's running the show then?
Not far from the breweries, the city of the Falcon God is yielding up a spectacular answer. Friedman has uncovered the foundations of a tomb complex. It's the burial ground of the ancient king of Hierakonpolis.
This is the largest tomb of its time period yet known, and that time period is about 3800 BC. It's 5.5 meters by 3 meters, so it's 2 to 3 times larger than anything we've ever known.
The excavations are revealing building projects on a monumental scale. King Scorpion's ancestors may have lived among them, and they could also have inspired the massive architecture of the pharaohs. Around the tomb are holes which once held wooden columns. One base is still intact, an extraordinary 6 millennia later. It's made from acacia wood, a sign that trees once grew in this barren landscape. The posts were embedded to a depth of almost 5 feet. Friedman believes they were meant to support a huge structure.
You may be looking at something that's 6 meters above ground. An acacia tree at full size can grow to be 10 meters. So it could be something quite dramatic.
The span between the posts suggests they were designed to take a roof, possibly of reed matting. Fragments of red plaster and cedar wood from the Middle East point to walls expensively finished and decorated with colourful designs.
To imagine these tall structures with this splash of color must have been really impressive, a real sight to be seen.
Inside the tomb itself, excavators found objects that prefigure some of the classic works of art commissioned by the pharaohs. They include the nose and ears from Egypt's earliest life-size statue and ceramic burial masks.
You're trying to protect your head, you're trying to protect your face for eternity. So they are the precursors of the gilded masks, the mask of Tutankhamun with its gold and its lapis lazuli incrustations. This is where it all began.
Just yards from the tomb, the archaeologists found the remains of a second wooden structure. This was also a clear prototype for the stone architecture of the pharaohs.
So over here we have what must be a funerary temple. The earliest in Egypt, like everything here. It's a whole area where there's no graves, but we have these large pillared halls. Imagine a forest of columns rising up.
With a design similar to the tomb but on a much larger scale, this was a sophisticated structure that would have stunned those who walked through it.
Again, we also know that there was color. We have plaster on the walls. We have red, we have green, we have figural decorations. So imagine walking into something like that, standing proud in this wadi.
This was the direct ancestor of the monumental hyper-style hall at Karnak, built some 2,000 years later. Excavations have revealed an entire royal cemetery, a sacred enclosure full of tombs and temples. It's now clear that Scorpion and the kings of Dynasty Zero built on the achievements of the rulers buried here.
Kings that were once considered to be the first, the earliest, are now clearly just the heirs to a long tradition of development and innovation that began 500 years before they were even born.
The finds at Hierakonpolis may help experts to imagine the city King Scorpion would have lived in. Now archaeologists are seeing clues in his intriguing royal regalia that could take the history of Egypt even further back in time. Inside the tomb, which may once have held the body of King Scorpion, archaeologists found a crooked scepter, a precursor of one buried with King Tutankhamun 18 centuries later. Experts now see it as a sign that Egyptian culture may have had its earliest roots in a surprising place, the desert. Today, most of Egypt's population is crammed into the narrow strip of cultivated land that borders the Nile. To the east and west lie large swathes of arid desert. In one of its least explored areas, the Eastern Sahara, Rudolf Cooper has been collecting evidence of human activity. He believes that rock art here predates the pharaohs by thousands of years, and the carvings depict the impossible: elephants in the middle of the desert.
You see the tail, you see the legs, you see the tusks here, and then the long, long trunk ending here. I think a picture of an elephant here in the desert seems to be like a miracle.
The explanation: climate change. Around 10,000 BC, monsoon rains transformed the Sahara from a desert into a fertile land, home to elephants, ostriches, and many other animals that have long since vanished from the region.
The plants came, the animals followed, and finally man followed the animals. These people were hunters, gatherers, and fishers.
Rock art also seems to show that later, around 3,000 years before the pharaohs, the hunters of the Sahara turned into herdsmen of cattle, sheep and goats. Cooper has found traces of these nomads scattered across the vast desert. But despite centuries of excavation, there's hardly any evidence of human beings living at this time in the Nile Valley.
The reason might be that the environment in the Nile Valley was too moist, and that there were a lot of illnesses and so on, that people didn't like to live there.
But then the rains dried up once more. The savanna began changing back into desert. The nomads began moving out. 1,000 years before the pharaohs, and they had mostly gone, spanning out in all directions through Africa. At the same time, settlements are found springing up in the Nile Valley, now no longer too damp and unhealthy. This period of climate change and migration could explain why Egyptian civilization arose when it did.
We might call the desiccation of the Sahara a motor of Africa's history.
It seems those who headed east to the Nile Valley took their desert culture with them.
They brought with them not only their economy and their way of living, they also brought with them their beliefs, their ideologies. And maybe some of this can be traced back even in the religion of ancient Egypt.
The nomadic herdsmen of the desert, so close to their animals, were perhaps the origin of some of the most important symbols of the pharaoh's power.
The classic pharaonic regalia of the crook and the goad, two items used in animal husbandry, take us back to those prehistoric origins of ancient Egyptian rulers as cattle herders.
Before the pharaohs, the Scorpion King was also buried with a crook carved in ivory. And this wasn't the only herder's emblem he passed on to his successors.
From the Scorpion King and the Narmer palette onwards, one of the key items of royal regalia worn in the pharaoh's waistband was a bull's tail, a symbol of virility and of animal power. And again, it casts us back to that prehistoric period of cattle herding. 2,400
years ago, the Greek historian Herodotus described Egypt as the gift of the Nile. Cooper believes that's just half the story.
If we include the results from the desert, one might perhaps say Egypt is also, not completely, but also the gift of the desert.
These discoveries are completing the work begun by James Quibell, who first revealed the Scorpion King's existence a century ago. He was among the first to question the common assumption that a superior race arrived from outside to kick-start Egyptian civilization. Now a very different picture has emerged.
Egypt no longer seems to arise as if from nowhere with the pyramids or with the First Dynasty, but we can trace its origins right back into prehistory, and it puts a whole new light on the development of civilization in North Africa.
The search for the Scorpion King has revealed a man who was a pivotal figure in the creation of ancient Egypt.
He was a mysterious king, but now we can really see what he did, what kind of things that he achieved, and we can see a real man in front of us.
He built on the achievements of earlier cultures, epitomized by the great city of Hierakonpolis. He helped unify Egypt through trade and battle.
The events that Scorpion's union of Upper Egypt sets in motion really set the stage for much of what we think of as the main elements of pharaonic civilization.
He organized his kingdom with the world's earliest phonetic writing system. He began a new style of burial that may have inspired the complex tombs and pyramids of the pharaohs. Now at last, experts are discovering the true origins of ancient Egypt and the remarkable legacy of the Scorpion King.